Good afternoon. How is everybody doing today? Yay. My name is Paolo DiGregorio. I was here a few months ago. I don't remember what I was talking about then, but I have come back to talk a little bit about a history topic in early American history. Now, my background is as a historian and an archaeologist. I currently teach history at Bridgewater State University. So, talking about history, thinking about history is fun for me. And in this talk, we're actually going to get me into a little bit of an archaeological mindset also. So if I start talking too much about broken pieces of pottery, just wave your arms at me and get me back on track. But today we are diving into a story that's somewhat of a familiar story, yet we're looking at it from a different angle. 2 days from now is what? Thanksgiving. And of course, Thanksgiving is a holiday in which we gather together with family. We give thanks, as the name of the holiday implies, but it is loosely based on a tradition that starts way back in the 1620s with some of the earliest English inhabitants of this region of New England itself. But what we're going to look at today isn't so much the pilgrims, but what led to the pilgrims coming here? What was going on prior to 1620 on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, here in North America and over there in England, that led to this collision of cultures, that led to this moment aboard the Mayflower at Plymouth that essentially laid the foundations for what we would today describe as New England, and really the foundations for the United States. So we're going to dive into this period of before the Mayflower and look at the paths that brought us to 1620. Now, we start off by asking the question, what is the Mayflower? It's a boat. That boat right there. Have any of you had the luck of going down to Plymouth, going down to Plymouth Harbor and seeing the replica of the Mayflower that's there? What's the first impression you get when you see the Mayflower? It's tiny. It is not a big boat at all. It is a very little boat. It's not even the length of this room. And yet what we have is about 140 passengers on that boat making the trip across the North Atlantic in the fall of 1620. That in and of itself is a remarkable story, but that's really toward the end of our discussion today. We do have to remember that when those pilgrims came across the Atlantic Ocean, when they arrived here in North America, in New England, they were entering into a world that was already long inhabited, that there had been people living in this area for thousands of years. And it was those people that were here already that would help those pilgrims survive, that would allow for Plymouth to take root and for it to expand and to grow, and later Englishmen to arrive here in the region. So we're going to start our discussion today by thinking about and looking at the Native Americans that were here in this region prior to 1620 and what was going on in this region when the pilgrims arrived. Now, we do have to kind of zoom out a little bit to think about the entire aspect of Native American history. Too often in our history classes, in high school, in elementary school, and even to a degree in college, the Native Americans of the American continents, we're just looking at North America over here, are grouped together as one monolithic whole, as if all of their cultures were the same, as if people lived the same way throughout this vast region. But as we know, there is a tremendous amount of environmental diversity in North America. Anybody been to Florida? What's the weather like in Florida? It's hot, it's humid, there's giant mosquitoes and alligators and things like that. How about Alaska? Anybody been to Alaska? Would you wear the same clothing in Alaska that you wear in Florida? I mean, you could, but you'd stand out, I suppose. In Alaska, it's cold, it's icy, it's winter much of the year. Yet there were people, native peoples that lived in Alaska, that lived in Florida, that lived here in the desert Southwest, that lived on the Great Plains, and that lived in these areas of the eastern part of the United States or North America, what we call the eastern woodlands. And in each of those geographic areas, those cultural areas, There were distinct cultures, distinct modes of survival that develop amongst the people. So, the Navajo down here, they develop agriculture in the desert of the Southwest. The people on the Great Plains, they survived by hunting the buffalo. Down here in Florida, you had an abundance of natural wildlife and plant life all around you. You didn't have to work as hard to find those food resources. And up in the green area here, the northeastern woodlands, you had a combination of hunting and gathering and small-scale subsistence agriculture. So people developed techniques to survive in the region in which they lived. Now we're going to zoom into that area in the northeast, the eastern woodlands, and look at some of the characteristics of eastern woodlands Native American culture. Now, this broad area that is called the eastern woodlands stretches roughly from the Great Lakes all the way down to the Chesapeake Bay. And what you see within that are numerous different Native American groups, tribes, clans, nations that are all within that broad general area. Each of those names that we see there, each of those tribes, those groups, had their own distinct social structures. They often had their own languages, their own religious beliefs. Now, there were cultural commonalities among them. They survived in much the same way, hunting similar game, planting similar crops, adapting to the weather in this broad general region. But each group was distinct. It was different from its neighbors. It thought of itself as a sovereign entity, as its own thing in regard to where it was located, where they were located in this area of the eastern woodlands. Now, as an archaeologist, I used to do a lot of archaeology down in this area over here. The eastern woodlands are a particularly rich culture to study because of the artifacts that these people left behind. One of the distinguishing characteristics in terms of artifacts of the Eastern Woodlands groups was that they were very adept at using ceramics. There's a lot of ceramic production of the people of the Eastern Woodlands. Now, what are ceramics? It's pottery. How do you make ceramics? What's the basis of it? Clay. So there had to be an abundance of clay that these people could use to make their ceramics. And what we see is that during the woodland period, the people that lived in this region did create a variety of different ceramic vessels, different types of ceramic jars and cups and plates and that sort of thing. It's much like if you go to your kitchen cupboard and you open up your kitchen cupboard and you have too many coffee cups and all the cereal bowls kind of spilling out. It was that type of a situation. There was a wide array, a wide diversity of ceramic vessel types, ceramic vessel bodies, the material that was used to strengthen the clay. All of that was different depending on where we were within the Eastern Woodlands, but all of these Eastern Woodlands cultures do develop a broad array of ceramics. And we see some examples of broken pots, again, the stuff that archaeologists really like, created during the Eastern Woodlands period. Now, why do archaeologists like this stuff? Broken pottery, broken pieces, these sherds of ceramics last for a very, very long time. Sure, you have your cereal bowl, you drop it on the ground, it breaks into a million pieces, but those little pieces will last for a long time in the garbage heap, in the hole in the backyard. So archaeologists love to find this stuff because it lasts for a long time, plus we can classify it. We can classify the ceramics by the type of clay that it is, by the type of binding material within the clay. Is it a shell, or is it sand, or is it grit, or that sort of stuff? And we can classify it by the decorative patterns on it. You notice these over here, the 6 on the left, have those kind of incisions in it. That is an impressed decoration. That was made while the clay was still wet, and then when it was fired, that impression settled in, became a permanent part of the ceramic itself. These 6 pieces are relatively thin, relatively refined. Those might have been for drinking vessels or kind of high-status objects, a nice pot that you're going to have for show. That one over there on the right is very, very different. That is kind of clunky and thick and ugly. What do we think that might have been used for? It might have been used for cooking, but probably more for storage. You would make that ceramic vessel, you'd dig a hole in the ground, you'd stick that in there, you'd store your grain, you'd store liquid in there. It was probably a store vessel because it was very utilitarian. It was not meant to look pretty. It was meant to be very, very functional. So we see a wide array of ceramics created during the Eastern Woodlands period. Here are a couple more examples. This one here on the left is remarkably intact. It did have to be put back together, kind of like a jigsaw puzzle, but all the pieces are right there. Any idea what this pot on the left might be used for? There's a couple of hints. The shape of it and some of the discoloration on it. It was probably, wine would be nice, but it was probably used for cooking. This was probably a pot that sat in the embers of your fire. How did you cook stuff? You made a big fire, then when the coals kind of broke down, you have that nice pile of glowing red embers. You would take this pot with its rounded bottom, stick it in the embers, and cook whatever you wanted inside the vessel itself. So let's say we're making a nice rabbit stew with some carrots or potatoes or something like that. Now we know that it was probably used for cooking because if we look here and over there, there's evidence of burning. So we see a ceramic vessel that was used for a utilitarian purpose, for a very distinct purpose for cooking in the process of food production. That example over on the right is a fragment of a vessel, but look at the decoration on that. That is tremendously elaborate. You have these swirls and these diamonds and these zigzag lines. That was a high status type of object. That was something that you didn't use every day, but you pulled out for special occasions or you kept on the shelf to show off that you had this type of ceramics that you could use. I kind of equate that to grandma's fine china. You know, it's up there in the cupboard, you show it off, maybe you pull it out for Thanksgiving, but you don't really use it the rest of the year and it just sits there collecting dust until it's time to show it off again. That is probably what that was, some sort of status symbol, some sort of, had some sort of important purpose that it served in the community among the people that created it. Now, those impressions, again, were made before the ceramic was fired. That was when it was still wet clay. And how those were made were actually with a carved paddle. You would have carved a wooden paddle and then pressed it into the ceramic, into the wet clay before firing it. And then once you fired it, those impressions became a permanent part of the design. It brought the status, elevated the status of that object itself. So we know that people of the Eastern Woodlands, from the Great Lakes region down to the Chesapeake Bay, used ceramics. It was an important part of their daily life, an important part of their food preparation and their food storage, and even their transportation, carrying stuff from point A to point B. Another question we do have to ask about the people of the Eastern Woodlands is we know they were all over this broad area, but what did they live in? What kind of structures did they build to survive? What did their villages look like? There were two predominant types of housing, of structures that were built by the people of the Eastern Woodlands, again, from the Chesapeake Bay up to the Great Lakes. One was called a longhouse, which we see an example of here on the left. Longhouses, as the name implies, tended to be skinny and long structures. These were of a more permanent nature. They were made out of tree trunks, tree branches that were planted into the ground that were then bent and tied together. And then it was covered with either tree bark or thick grasses or animal hides. This was meant to provide long-term shelter for usually a couple of families at a time. These were protection from the weather, protection from the elements. They were the home base, if you will, of the people of the Eastern Woodlands. The door that we see over here could be covered up by an animal hide when there was bad weather. Up at the top, there was a flap that could be opened up to allow the smoke from the fire in the center of the building to escape up through the top. So many Eastern Woodlands native villages would have had collections of longhouses. That would have been where the people lived. Another important type of structure for the people of the Eastern Woodlands were the thing you see over there on the right, the wigwam, also called a witu. Wigwams tended to be more temporary type structures. These were things that you would throw up for a season. If you were out hunting far away from the village, you needed shelter, you'd build a wigwam. It could be built relatively quickly out of branches and leaves and that sort of stuff. It was meant to be a temporary shelter for maybe 2 or 3 people at a time. So the hunting party that's out over there At night, we'd gather up in the wigwam, we'd stay safe from the weather, from wild animals, and then we'd leave in the day to go hunting, and we'd come back there. It was not meant to be a long-term solution for housing, but something that was rather easy to build and easy to take down for a relatively short period of time. So we know that the people of the Eastern Woodlands had these kinds of dwellings. Now, how do we know that? Neither of these survive for very long. They're made out of tree branches and bark and that sort of stuff. There is archaeological evidence of these, but the archaeological evidence is really a series of stains in the soil where the branches would have been. That's not a lot to build on. One of the reasons we know that these existed was because, well, not cave pictures, we'll get to drawings in a second, but because the people that were building these, their descendants are still around. And the tradition of building these structures is passed down from generation to generation to generation. So down at Plymouth, Patuxent, Plymouth, there are descendants of the Wampanoags who know how to build these structures, who have that as part of their heritage, of their culture. We do have written descriptions of these from early European explorers, and we do have some pictures, not in caves, but from a European explorer, an Englishman, who visits North America in the late 16th century, a man named John White. John White was part of an English expedition, an exploring party that had been sent from England to the coast of North America to find a suitable location in which to establish an English outpost. The English had seen many of their European rivals, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, even the Dutch, beginning to become very wealthy from exploiting the goods, the resources they found in the Americas. And the English were kind of late in the game in getting into North America, and I'll explain that in the second half of the talk. But by the 1580s, there was an attempt by the English to establish a colony, but they had to find a location first. So this expedition that included John White sails across the Atlantic Ocean and ends up in the region of the Chesapeake Bay, the border between Virginia and North Carolina. White was an artist, so everywhere he went, he created little images of what he saw around him, the plants, the animals, the people that he encountered. And when he returned to England, these drawings were finalized, they were colorized, and they were published. And they gave many Englishmen their first view of North America and the people that were there. So White, in his explorations, does give us a firsthand view of what he encountered here in North America. Now, we do have to remember, John White was an Englishman, and he was interpreting everything through that very English lens. But he does kind of give us a snapshot of that moment in time among the people of the Eastern Woodlands. This upper image shows men fishing, using a variety of techniques for capturing fish. The men in the foreground are in a dugout canoe. You can see the variety of sea life that was there abundant along the Atlantic coast, from what looked like hammerhead sharks to other large types of fish. The men in the background are spear fishing. And then kind of coming across the image in the upper left corner is a fish weir. What is a fish weir? It's kind of a net. It's a fish trap, essentially. Fish weirs were a series of thin branches pushed into the mud at the bottom of a body of water. The fish would swim or be pushed by the current into the fish weir. They'd get trapped between the sticks, and they couldn't get out. The fishermen then just had to go with their basket and start collecting all the fish that were trapped there. It was an easy way of catching fish. So we know that the native peoples had advanced fishing techniques. They had all sorts of technology that they had developed to catch fish along the coast of North America. The second image over here shows us a Native American village. Again, during that Eastern Woodlands period, it's a village that John White calls Sikatan. You can see it down here at the bottom. And what he is giving us in this is kind of an overview of what these habitations looked like, the kind of places where the native peoples lived. You can see a collection of longhouses kind of set up along this central plaza. Off to one side, here in the foreground, there's some sort of ceremony going on, maybe a religious ceremony of some sort. The men dancing over here. There's a communal meal being laid out right here in the middle of the village. We have their agricultural fields off to one side. So we know that these native peoples, they grew their crops. They grew things like corn. In fact, I think this is called the field where they plant their corn. I can't quite make out the writing on it right there. But John White is giving us this snapshot. his English interpretation of what he encountered when he arrived here in North America, how people were living in this part of the world. And as I said, it really was the first time that many Europeans saw this, had this view of the native peoples of North America. Now, one of the keys to survival for these native peoples was an adaptation of agriculture. They began to grow crops that survived well, that grew well in this environment of the eastern woodlands. And the three most important crops that were developed, that flourished here, were known collectively as the Three Sisters. Beans, corn, and squash. Now, we have Thanksgiving on Thursday. You're probably going to have 2 out of these 3 on your table at some point or another, right? These are all Native American crops that develop in the American continents, generally in Central America or South America, but they do spread to many of the native cultures across both North and South America. And they become the staple crops of the people of the eastern woodlands. Now, what is it about these 3 crops that makes them so important for the native peoples, that they do become called the Three Sisters? Well, they are easy to preserve. You grow your beans, you dry your beans, they last forever. You grow your corn, you dry your corn, it will last forever. You can grind the corn into like a flour, and then you could bake fritters with it if you want. You can make it into a sort of bread. You can do the same with the beans. It's less tasty, I suppose. And the squash, even though you can't dry your squash really all that well, squash does tend to survive for a good amount of time. You could dig a root cellar and store your squash there to preserve it, and it provides you with long-lasting food resources. In addition to that, the beans, the corn, and the squash are all complementary to one another in terms of nutrition. That is a complete diet right here in terms of calories, in terms of vitamins, in terms of nutrients. You have everything you need with these 3 crops. Now, these were the staple crops of the native peoples throughout North America, throughout eastern North America. They are the basis for their diet. This was often supplemented by hunting and fishing. We saw the example of fishing already, but other wildlife was hunted. I don't know if there's a lot of turkeys here in Wellesley. I live down in Mansfield, and there's flocks of turkeys all over the place. So imagine that situation if you're a person of the eastern woodlands. You just step outside your door, grab a turkey by the neck, essentially, and you can add that to your meal that you have over here. So the agriculture and the hunting provided all the nutritional basis for the needs of the people. Now, these 3 crops in particular, aside from the nutritional value that was provided for them, grew well together. How does corn grow? What type of plant is corn? It's on a stalk. It grows tall and pretty thick. Beans, what do beans grow on? Kind of on vines. They curl up. So you would plant your corn, the corn grows straight, you plant your beans, the beans would curl up around the corn stalks. And then you plant your squash. And how do squash grow? Low across the ground, big and leafy. And the squash would spread out. The spreading out of the squash would prevent weeds from growing up on your agricultural fields. So you plant these 3 things together. They are supporting one another in terms of growing, and they provide all the nutrition, all the food you need, and you can keep it. You can store it for a long period of time. So successful agriculture allowed for the long-term survival of the people of the eastern woodlands. So we see ceramics, we see specific types of housing, we see hunting, we see fishing, we see agriculture. All of these were keys to the survival of the people of the eastern woodlands. Now, if we were to zoom in on our eastern woodlands a little bit more and take a look at southern New England, these are the native groups that were the major native groups here in southern New England. A couple of things to notice. You had the Wampanoags over here. They play an important role in our story. It's the Wampanoags that the Pilgrims first encounter. The Nauset over here on Cape Cod were associated with the Wampanoags. The Narragansett here in Rhode Island were bitter enemies of the Wampanoags. These 2 groups did not get along. There were rivalries. There was competition for land and resources. Down here in southeastern Connecticut, you had the Pequot Pequots and the Mohegans. The Pequots were a rather aggressive group who had actually conquered and dominated the Mohegans. And the Pequots were relatively unpopular among the other native groups. Nobody really trusted the Pequots. They were too aggressive in their actions, too busy building casinos and annoying everybody else. And then you had other groups like the Nipmuc in the Massachusetts, up around Boston, the Tunxus in the Hartford area, and down here on Long Island, the Shinnecock and other groups. So there were numerous Native American groups that were in this relatively small area of southern New England. And each of these groups was a distinct entity. They viewed themselves as their own culture, their own nation, if you want to use that term. They had rivalries, they had alliances, there were animosities, there was a lot of shifting dynamics among these groups. So even this relatively small area, we see rivalry, we see competition, we see cooperation among the native peoples in the region. That's an important part of our story also. And if we were to zoom in a little bit more, maybe, there it is, we can focus on the Wampanoag Territory itself. The Wampanoag Territory was basically the area south of what is today the Hockomock Swamp, going down to the coast of southeastern Massachusetts and out to Cape Cod. One of the things to notice throughout this region is that you had numerous independent villages. You can see them listed there, Acushnet, and Pocasset, and Assinet, and Nemasket over there, and Patuxet. Each of these were their own village, separated from the other Wampanoag villages, but all part of the same cultural entity, this same cultural group. Each village would have had a headman, would have had its own leadership, but overall, the Wampanoags also had kind of high-ranking chiefs who would have been responsible for the defense and the coordination of everything that was going on within this vast territory. So this is the situation we see here in southeastern Massachusetts. As we are heading into the late 16th, the early 17th century, I should have said earlier that I've been having technical difficulties with my tablet, and every once in a while that happens. I thought we were running too smoothly here. But you had these native groups that were functioning as their own political entities, as their own cultural entities, with their rivalries, complexity even within these cultural units. The Wampanoags covered a wide area. They had their own systems of communication among these different villages over there. Now, by the time we get to about 1600, the native peoples were aware that there were other people on the other side of the ocean. They were aware that there were Europeans who were making contact with native peoples. Part of the reason why there was this knowledge of the other had to do with what we see over here. It had to do with fishing. European fishermen had for decades been pushing further and further away from the coast of Europe, looking for fruitful fishing waters. And by the time we get to the late 16th, early 17th century, many of those European fishermen had ended up over here. The Grand Banks off of Newfoundland and Nova Scotia, and this area here off of Cape Cod. Abundant fishing land where there was a lot of fish to catch. So these European fishermen were setting sail into the North Atlantic, arriving here off the coast of North America, and catching a bounty of fish. Now, what was one of the most important types of fish they were catching? Cod. They named a cape after it. Cod was hugely significant. Now, cod is a pretty big fish, particularly at that time. Wild North Atlantic cod was a sizable fish, and you could feed a lot of people with North Atlantic cod. But these fishermen had a problem. We've had a successful catch there off the coast of northern Maine. We've caught all the cod we can possibly eat, can possibly carry. How are we going to get it back to Europe? You don't want to have your ship full of fish because, spending 2 weeks sailing back across the Atlantic Ocean, that fish is going to be inedible and the smell is going to be incredible. So we had to preserve the catch. One way was by salting it. The other way was by smoking it. Could you do either of those on board your ship? No. In any case, we have fishermen, lots of fish. They have to preserve their catch to bring it back across the Atlantic Ocean. They have to make landfall. So they do start landing their ships along the coast of North America. And as they are there, taking care of preserving their catch, salting and smoking it, they are drawing the curiosity of the native inhabitants who are watching from the dunes, looking down from the tree line at these weirdly dressed men coming in these big boats across the Atlantic Ocean. And gradually what happens? The natives, driven by curiosity, begin to come out from the forest. They begin to make contact with these European sailors. An informal system of exchange begins to develop. Connections begin to develop. The Europeans are trading things like knives and glass for fresh fruit and vegetables from the native peoples. You begin to establish ties between the European fishermen and the native peoples. Now, the native peoples were very, very smart in how they dealt with the Europeans. Many of the native peoples begin to learn some of the European languages. They might learn a few words of English, a few words of French, maybe a little bit of Portuguese, because they were conducting these interactions with the Europeans. Some of the European ship captains may have learned a few words of the Native American languages, Abenaki or Algonquin or whatever. We don't really know. But many of the native leaders also started to identify the individual ships. And, oh, that's Captain Smith over there. We don't like him. He's cheap. He doesn't trade well with us. But Captain Jacques, the French guy, we like him. He brings us French wine. He's okay. We'll trade with him. So they began to identify the ships. They began to know who the captains were. They began to learn the languages. And what we see is this informal system of exchange that does develop among the people, the native peoples of northern New England and southern Canada, and those European ship captains that were fishing off the waters of the Atlantic coast of North America. And this system, this relationship, seemed to benefit both sides. Everybody was getting something from the other side. The relationships were generally pretty warm, pretty cordial at the very least. So we know that in the early 17th century, there were numerous thriving communities of native peoples along the coast. We know this because of English or European accounts. We know this because of the vitality of the trade there. And we actually have depictions of some of those native communities, like this one. This is an image of the Wampanoag village of Patuxet from around 1606, an image that was created by English sailors, English navigators, who entered into the bay just near Patuxet. You can see they were taking soundings for the depth of the water there. What it depicts are numerous houses, long houses surrounded by agricultural fields, cornfields scattered throughout. You can see some of the native peoples here gathered on the shore looking at the English boat there in the middle. There's even a couple of native canoes that are depicted here in the water. So we know that in 1606, Patuxet, this Wampanoag village on the coast, was flourishing. It looked like it was in a good situation. It had people, it had farms. Things looked really, really good for the Wampanoags at that point. Now, a year after this map was created in 1607, the English finally do succeed in establishing an outpost in North America. In 1607, where was the first permanent English settlement? Jamestown, Virginia. The previous attempt in 1586 at Roanoke had failed miserably. And it took another 20 years before the English tried again, but they do eventually establish this outpost down at Jamestown, Virginia. Now, Jamestown in its early years was pretty much a financial disaster. The early Englishmen that arrived at Jamestown had arrived to turn a profit, but they soon discovered there was very little profitable in that area of Virginia. They were instead dying off of disease, dying of starvation, getting into wars with the native peoples in that region. There were cases of murder and all sorts of unpleasantness that was taking place at Jamestown, James Fort at that time. Yet, Jamestown is hugely important because it did establish an English foundation here in North America. And it was from Jamestown that later English expeditions would sail up and down the coast of North America, exploring, but also laying an English claim to much of that territory. One of those expeditions was led by a guy named John Smith. Anybody know John Smith? Such a unique and original name. This John Smith you might be familiar with because he's the guy involved in the story with Pocahontas. John Smith was an English adventurer, a man who was trying to make a fortune and establish himself. He does undertake an expedition around 1616 of sailing up and down the coast of North America, and he provides the information that eventually leads to the creation of this map. And what is this map showing us? Well, there is a clue. If we look down here, there is this arm that kind of sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean. Cape Cod. So this is a map of northern New England, the coast of Maine and southern Canada. John Smith is one of the first Englishmen to chart this area. This map is eventually created from his expeditions. Now, I do have to point out that the map itself is a little bit later than John Smith, and there are some clues to that, like the name of the river right here, the River Charles. That wasn't quite named that yet, but it is eventually named the River Charles. So the English are exploring. Europeans have made contact with the native peoples of North America, and everything seems to be going well until it isn't. Because this contact between the coastal native inhabitants of New England and those European sailors not only led to the exchange of ideas and the communication of languages and the exchange of goods, but it led to the spread of diseases, particularly European diseases making their way into the native populations. Now, we have to remember that the native inhabitants of the Americas had essentially lived in isolation from other parts of the world for thousands and thousands of years. So diseases that were common in Europe, in Asia, and Africa, things like smallpox and measles and influenza, that were not necessarily fatal on the eastern side of the Atlantic Ocean, the people that were living here on the western side of the Atlantic Ocean did not have natural immunities to those. So when Europeans begin interacting with the native peoples, those diseases begin to spread, and they have a catastrophic effect on the native populations in the Americas. Here in New England, from 1616 to 1619, there is a period that is known as the Great Dying, when about 90% of the native population in New England dies because of these European diseases, these imported diseases. You have a traumatic incident that occurs, destroying lives, destroying villages, destroying communities. One of the victims of this, or one of the casualties of this, was that Wampanoag village of Patuxet, which in 1606 was thriving. By 1619, it was completely abandoned. Everybody had died. So that is part of the legacy of this early contact between native peoples and those European fishermen along the coast. Now, this happens prior to the arrival of the Mayflower. The Mayflower arrives in 1620. So you have these societies in North America that are thriving, that are flourishing, and suddenly, because of this great dying, because of these diseases, their entire demographic, their entire livelihood changes dramatically because of this great tragedy. While that was happening here, however, we can ask the question, what was going on in England? Because England was itself undergoing a transformation during the 16th and into the 17th century. And perhaps the most important aspect of that English transformation, certainly one that would impact what happens here in North America, was a religious one. The beginnings of the English Reformation. How many of you recognize this guy over here? Oh, his name is up there. Henry VIII. What is Henry VIII best known for? Lots of wives. Everybody says wives. Yes, he had a lot of wives, 6 wives. That is the reason why he is really important, however. It is Henry VIII who introduces Protestantism to England. He breaks away from the Roman Catholic Church. Now, why does he do that? He wanted to get a divorce from his first wife. Now, we have to kind of dive into Henry VIII's private life, I guess, to really lay this out. Henry VIII was the King of England. He was married to Catherine of Aragon, who was a Spanish princess, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella. Now, this marriage was actually Catherine's second marriage. She had briefly been married to Henry's older brother, Arthur. England was in line for an actual King Arthur. But Prince Arthur dies before he has any children, before he becomes the king. And when Prince Arthur dies, his younger brother Henry becomes the heir to the throne. When Henry VII dies, Henry VIII becomes the King of England, and Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess, is now the Queen of England. Now, as with any good king, what was one of the things that Henry needed to do? He needed to protect his dynasty. He needed to have an heir to the throne. And Henry really wanted a male heir. He wanted a son. of what might be occurring. If you can have a daughter in England, a woman could inherit the throne, but it gets messy. What happens if she gets married? What happens to her husband? That sort of stuff. So Henry really wanted a son. He does have a child with Catherine of Aragon, but it's a girl. Her name was Mary. Princess Mary. So Henry is kind of disappointed, and he's starting to grow desperate. His wife is getting close to the end of her childbearing age, and Henry does not have the son he wants. So he begins to kind of drift away from Catherine of Aragon, I guess we could say. Now, Henry had a vivacious court. He liked to have fun. There were musicians and dancers and lots of pretty girls at court. And as he is growing increasingly desperate that he doesn't have the male heir that he wants, his eye falls on a lovely young 19-year-old girl at court named Anne Boleyn. Now, Anne Boleyn was from a politically ambitious English family, and Anne Boleyn was a very, very astute politician herself, though she was of a young age. Henry desperately wanted to get with Anne Boleyn. He offered to make her his mistress, and she said, "No, you can't have me unless I'm the queen." So Henry now wants to marry Anne Boleyn, but he has a problem. He's already got a wife. So Henry needs to figure out how to get rid of wife number one. I shouldn't say get rid of. How to divorce wife number one so that he can marry Anne Boleyn, who he knows will produce a male heir. So Henry appeals to the Pope in Rome for a divorce. And the Pope says, "Gee, Henry, I'd love to help you out." I'm paraphrasing, of course, but I can't. Now, why couldn't the Pope help out Henry? Well, who was Catherine of Aragon? She was a Spanish princess. She was the aunt of the most powerful monarch in Europe, Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor and King of Spain. The Pope needed Charles V and the King as his ally, partly because in Germany, the Protestant Reformation had broken out. Martin Luther taxed his list of complaints on the church door in 1517. So the Pope was fighting against Protestantism in Germany, needed the help of the Holy Roman Emperor, and had he granted the divorce to Henry, he would have offended the Holy Roman Emperor. So the Pope says, "I can't do that for you." So Henry says, "Well, okay, I am basically going to make a big decision, Pope. I am withdrawing the Church of England from your authority. From now on, the church in England is led by the monarch. Whoever the monarch is the head of the church in England." So Henry basically breaks away from the Roman church and makes himself the head of the church in England. That's what we see depicted over here. You have Henry VIII sitting on his throne, resting his feet on the Pope, whose papal tiara has fallen off and broken into pieces right there. Nice piece of political allegory in that print right there. So Henry is now the head of the Church of England, and what does he manage to arrange? What do his ministers manage to arrange? A divorce from Catherine of Aragon. Now, Catherine of Aragon is heartbroken. She insists that she has been loyal to her husband and she is the true Queen of England, but Henry sends her off to an exile in a castle in England. His daughter Mary goes with her, living in isolation in this castle, and Henry goes off to marry Anne Boleyn, who is almost immediately pregnant and gives birth to a daughter, who they name Elizabeth. So Henry is like, another girl. But he is hopeful because Anne Boleyn is still young. She gives birth to Elizabeth and like 2 minutes later is pregnant again. And Henry is ever hopeful that this is the heir, this is the boy child, this is the heir that I've been looking for. Well, Anne Boleyn has a miscarriage. It was a boy child, but is never actually born. So Henry is now becoming a little bit more concerned. His wife is failing him. And the Boleyn family, and Anne Boleyn in particular, because of their high-handedness and their political ambition, have run afoul of powerful figures in court who begin to conspire against the queen. Soon, rumors are circulating that Anne Boleyn is cheating on the king, that she is conducting affairs with other members of court, including her own brother. Probably not true, but Henry's ministers... Thomas Cranmer, his prime minister, his chief minister, begin to investigate, and they begin to extract confessions from people at court, probably under duress. But soon there is a list of accusations against the queen presented to the king. The king has no choice but to sign his wife's death warrant, because cheating on the king is akin to treason. So Anne Boleyn is sentenced to death. She goes off to the Tower of London, where she is preparing to have her head chopped off. Now, in 16th century England, usually beheadings were done by an axeman, a guy with a big axe. But inevitably, the executioners were usually drunk, because they had an unpleasant task. So you have this big guy with an axe that wasn't necessarily sharp, chopping people's heads off. There are accounts that often he missed and hits people in the middle of the back, lopped off just the top of their head. It often took several swings and blows to actually sever the head from the body. Henry still had a soft spot for Anne Boleyn and didn't want to see her body mutilated. So he actually paid for a European swordsman from France with a super sharp sword to come to behead his wife, the queen. And the execution of Anne Boleyn goes off without a hitch, except for everybody else's part except hers. Her head comes off in one clean blow. She doesn't suffer. Great things for Henry. But he is still desperate. He still needs a male heir. So, within a couple of days, Henry is once again married to a woman named Jane Seymour, who is almost instantaneously pregnant. Henry's pretty good at that, at least early on in his reign. She does give birth to the long-awaited heir, a prince named Edward, becomes the Prince of Wales, who becomes the heir to the English throne. But within days of giving birth, Jane Seymour dies from complications of childbirth. So now Henry is the single father of 3 kids from 3 different women, once divorced, twice widowed. One by his own hand, I suppose. And he is ever hopeful. So he decides, I need help. I need to have a queen. So he arranges for another marriage to a woman named Anne of Cleves. Now, Henry and Anne never meet before this marriage is made official. It's basically an exchange of documents and an exchange of portraits. When Anne of Cleves arrives in England, Henry takes one look at her and goes, you don't look like your portrait. He's not attracted to her. He thinks she smells funny. She has weird manners. That marriage is very, very brief. Henry arranges to divorce her, sets her up with a nice castle in the English countryside. Anne of Cleves does okay for himself, but now Henry is twice divorced, twice widowed, still has those 3 kids, ever hopeful, looks for another bride. And who does he find as his 5th bride? Catherine Howard, another young, vivacious woman at court who happened to be Anne Boleyn's cousin. Catherine Howard is about 19 years old when she marries the king, who by this point is about 58. And not the handsome, young, athletic king he once was. He is, let's just say his passions have gotten the better of him, and he's kind of bloated and ill and unhealthy. Not necessarily an attractive figure for young Catherine Howard. Well, they're married regardless, but soon rumors begin to circulate at court that what is Catherine Howard doing? Yeah, she's taken up with the young men at court behind the king's back. So inevitably, what happens to Catherine Howard? She gets her head chopped off. I don't know if Henry sprung for a European executioner this time or just had the drunk English axeman do it. But Henry, now coming toward the end of his life, still ever hopeful perhaps, realizing he needed a helpmate, he needed somebody to take care of him in his later years, gets married for a 6th time to Catherine. Thank you. 3 of his wives were named Catherine. I guess it was easy. You didn't have to change the initials on the bath towels and that sort of stuff. But she does end up surviving the king. When Henry dies, he is briefly succeeded by his son Edward as King Edward VI. He is only around for about 5 years. He's 9 years old when he becomes the king. He is sickly. He is unhealthy. He dies without any heirs. When Edward dies, he is succeeded by his older half-sister, Mary. Mary, the daughter of Catherine of Aragon, was very much Catholic. And what does Mary try to do? But re-Catholicize England. She persecutes many of the leading Puritan Anglican scholars, like Ridley and Latimer and Tyndale. They are all executed during the reign of Mary. She gets a lovely nickname for this, by the way. Bloody Mary. She also invents a breakfast cocktail, apparently. But you have this. Mary is desperate to continue this Catholic rule over England. She actually marries the heir to the Spanish throne, a prince named Philip, the son of Charles V. It's all kind of intermingled. But she dies before having children. And when Mary dies, she is succeeded by her younger half-sister, Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Elizabeth once again begins re-Protestantizing, bringing England back to Protestantism, back to the Anglican Church. So what we see throughout much of the 16th century is a tremendous amount of religious conflict and religious turmoil in England. You have the Catholics, who are kind of marginalized. You have the Anglicans, that is the main church of England. And then there are other Protestant sects that begin to emerge, a group called the Puritans. The Puritans wanted to purify the English church from within. They were followers of the teachings of John Calvin, one of the important Reformation leaders on the continent in France and in Switzerland. Then you had another group that were the separatists, who thought that reform of the Anglican church could not be achieved from within, and that in fact, the entire church had to be torn down and you had to start anew. That group was called the separatists. They believed they had to build a new separate church to purify the religion, to follow the actual word of God. So you have all of this religious dynamism and this religious conflict going on in England during the reign of Elizabeth I. Well, Elizabeth I was famously known as the Virgin Queen. They named Virginia after her. She was called the Virgin Queen because she never gets married. And what does that mean when Elizabeth dies in 1603? She had no direct heirs. She had no children. So what happens to the crown of England? Well, it goes to her second cousin, the King of Scotland, James Stuart, who was at that point James VI, the King of Scotland. In 1603, James VI of Scotland becomes King James I of England. We see the unification of these two kingdoms in the person of the king. The crowns are still separate. So he's often referred to in historical texts as James I/6, or James 6/1 if you're talking about Scotland. In any case, we'll just refer to him as James I for the purposes of this discussion. James I becomes the King of England. And James I was very much a Protestant, very much as the King of England, now the leader of the Church of England. He wanted to try to maintain control of the religious establishment in England. He didn't necessarily like the Puritans, but really disliked those separatists because those separatists were causing trouble. They wanted to break away from the Church of England, and in essence, that was kind of an attack on the person of the king, who was the Church of England. So what we see during the reign of James I is that many of those separatists decide to flee, and they decide to go to the Netherlands. They go across the English Channel to the Dutch Republic, and they settle first in Amsterdam and then later in the city of Leiden. There, in the Dutch Republic, these English separatists are allowed to practice their religion freely. Now, what's going on in the Dutch Republic at the turn of the 17th century? Well, they were fighting against the Spanish. They were still technically part of the Spanish Empire, but had largely gained their independence by this point. The Dutch were predominantly Protestant, but they didn't really care that much about religion. Their main focus was money. This is during the golden age of the Dutch Republic, the age of Vermeer and Rembrandt, where Dutch ships are sailing around the world, establishing a commercial empire. And cities like Amsterdam are just raking in the money. They are becoming commercial superpowers. So the Dutch didn't really care what religion you were, as long as you weren't getting in the way of business. So these English separatists are free to practice their religion freely there in the Netherlands, but they are on the fringes of Dutch society. They are not necessarily reaping the benefits of this Dutch golden age. They're not directly involved in commerce. They're not directly involved in trade. They were still seen as outsiders. And those English separatists in the Netherlands generally had kind of marginal jobs. They were the housekeepers. They were the street sweepers. They were not at the forefront of Dutch society. Yet they were able to practice their religion freely, so many of them were content. They viewed themselves as outsiders, they viewed themselves as distinctly English, but they were not being persecuted because of their religion. They do start to have a problem, however, by the time we get to 1618, 1619, 1620. And it wasn't with the Dutch, it was with their children. Because the children of these English separatists had been growing up in the Dutch Republic, surrounded by Dutch culture, surrounded by the wealth of the Dutch. And many of those English children were embracing Dutch culture, were speaking Dutch, were dressing like the Dutch, were getting involved in business. And their parents were terrified. They didn't want Dutch children, they wanted English separatist children. So many of those English refugees in the Netherlands decided, you know what, in order to protect our children, we have to go back to England. It might be difficult for us. We might face religious persecution, but our children must remember that they are English and not Dutch. So large numbers of these English separatists by 1619, 1620 decide to go back to England. But once they arrive in England, what do they find? It kind of sucks here. We are being persecuted. We cannot practice our religion freely. We are being targeted by the establishment. We are outcasts in our own country. So ultimately, some of these English separatists decide to do something dramatic. They appeal to the king to get permission to leave England, to sail across the Atlantic Ocean, to establish an outpost in the northern parts of Virginia, where they could practice their religion freely. And the king says, great, I'll get rid of this headache. I'll send them across the Atlantic Ocean. That will cement English claims in North America, and I won't have to deal with these crazy separatists. Now, the separatists were viewed as extreme. Even the Puritans thought they were a little bit too much. So in 1620, the king gives these English separatists permission to set forth across the Atlantic Ocean to establish his outpost in northern Virginia. The separatists charter 2 ships, and they set out from Plymouth Harbor to sail to North America. As soon as the ships are out of the harbor, though, one of the ships begins to take on water. It is deemed to be unseaworthy, so both ships turn around, and all of the passengers on the second ship get on board the first ship, the Mayflower. And then the Mayflower sets sail across the Atlantic Ocean. Now, on board the Mayflower, on that several-week-long journey across the North Atlantic, you had about 102 passengers, 30 crewmen, and a collection of dogs, sheep, goats, and poultry. Now remember how big the Mayflower is. Maybe the length of this room. These were not luxurious accommodations. I imagine that the voyage was terrible. You had animals, you had lots of people. I bet many of the people were seasick on this voyage. I'm sure the smells were remarkable. The conditions were terrible, yet these people were driven by a desire to practice their religion without persecution. So they continue across the Atlantic Ocean. And after several weeks, they do finally spot land. They are excited to make landfall. And where is the first place that the Mayflower anchors and the pilgrims make landfall? Provincetown at the northern tip of Cape Cod. When the Mayflower arrives, some of the men get off the Mayflower, make their way ashore. They wander through the dunes. They look around. They say, this is pretty nice, but I bet it gets really crowded in the summertime with all the tourists and the artists. So they get back on board the Mayflower and decide to try to make it to where they were supposed to go, northern Virginia. Now, in the 16th century, northern Virginia to the English was the mouth of the Hudson River. So they were looking to get to New Jersey. They don't make it there, however, because as the Mayflower sets sail from Provincetown, trying to head south around Cape Cod, it runs into a massive storm. And the captain says, we can't go that way because we will all die. So he turns the ship around and they sail across the bay at Cape Cod and make landfall in a small bay near the mouth of a river at a place that the Wampanoags had called Patuxet. And it is there, at the former Wampanoag village of Patuxet, that the Pilgrims, as we shall now call them, decide to make landfall, decide to establish their outpost. And as we all know, they line up one by one and step on that one stone to make their way into Plymouth. You've all seen Plymouth Rock, right? Perhaps one of the most disappointing historical monuments anywhere. I can tell you the story of Plymouth Rock later. There's no proof that the Pilgrims actually stepped on it. In any case, they do make their way into what becomes Plymouth. They establish their colony there and almost immediately realize this may have been a bad idea. Because what happens? They arrive in November of 1620 after being at sea for several weeks. And they realize we're not really ready for this. We don't have enough food. We don't know about the weather. That first winter of 1620 to 1621, about half of the Pilgrims die. About 50 of them die. And as we go into 1621, March of 1621, the survivors are thinking, you know what, maybe it's better to go back to England and face religious persecution rather than dying out here in this godless wilderness on the edge of the world. There was a thought of going back, that was better than staying here. Just as it looked as if the Plymouth colony was about to collapse, however, something miraculous happens. A Native American man named Samoset one day walks into the English settlement and says, welcome, Englishmen. And then he asks if they have any beer. Now, you have to imagine the shock of the Pilgrims when this Native American man wanders in amongst them and starts addressing them in English and asking for beer. How did Samoset know any English? He was from northern Maine. He was visiting the Wampanoags. So he had had contact with English fishermen along the coast. He recognized these people as Englishmen. He walked in, he welcomed them to North America and said, hey, well, he apparently also got a fondness for English beer and that contact with English fishermen. But he does become an important factor in the survival of the Plymouth colony, because Samoset says to the pilgrims, I only speak a little bit of English, just a few words, but if you stay here, I'll come back in a couple of days with somebody who speaks English very well. And sure enough, what happens? A few days later, Samoset returns to the pilgrim settlement with a Wampanoag man named Tisquantum, who the English will call Squanto. Tisquantum spoke English very, very well. Now, how did he learn English? Not from the fishermen. He had actually been kidnapped by an English sea captain and brought to England, and had lived in England for several years as a servant or slave, depending on how you want to, which account you listen to. But in 1619, he convinced a friendly English sea captain to bring him home to his native village of Patuxet. When he arrived there, what did he find? Everybody was dead. So he was living with neighboring Wampanoags when the pilgrims arrived, and in March of 1621, he was there to help the pilgrims, well, as the story goes, to teach the pilgrims how to plant their crops. We see him planting the corn over there. And he becomes an intermediary between the pilgrims and the chief of the Wampanoags, a man named Massasoit. It is because of the intervention of Tisquantum that the pilgrims and the Plymouth settlement does actually survive. Those pilgrims manage to plant their crops. They form an alliance with the Wampanoags. Now, why would the Wampanoags be interested in an alliance with the pilgrims? Not necessarily trade. Certainly that was important, but that wasn't the main factor. Other Native American groups. Who was the great rival of the Wampanoags? But the Narragansetts. During that period of the Great Dying, the Wampanoags had been tremendously impacted. The Narragansetts, not as much. The Narragansetts didn't have as much contact with foreigners. So the Narragansetts their numbers remained good. The Wampanoag numbers had declined. And kind of as that happened, the Narragansetts grew more powerful than the Wampanoags. So Massasoit and the Wampanoags saw the arrival of the English as perhaps a chance to level the playing field, to readjust the balance. If we have these Englishmen on our side, that'll be a counterweight to the power of the Narragansetts. So there were political considerations at play. It wasn't just a humanitarian thing. It wasn't just friendliness. There were certainly regional politics that drove Massasoit's decision. In any case, the pilgrims do plant their crops in the spring of 1621. They do have a successful harvest. And in the fall of 1621, what do they decide to do? They decide to give thanks. So the pilgrims gather their harvest. They send some men out hunting. They catch some fowl, and they sit down for a feast. Who was not invited to that feast? The Wampanoags. Who showed up anyway? The Wampanoags, Massasoit and about 90 men. They come into Plymouth. They see the Englishmen celebrating. They sit down. Some of the natives go out. They catch a whole bunch of deer. They bring those in. And for 3, 4, 5 days, the Englishmen and the Wampanoags celebrate together, sharing communal meals there at what comes to be called the first Thanksgiving. Now, a lot of the mythology around the first Thanksgiving is just that, mythology. There are only 2 eyewitness accounts of what that first Thanksgiving was like. And neither one of them mention, stuffing or mashed potatoes or turkey. And both of them highlight the fact that the Wampanoags weren't really invited, but they showed up. But at least they brought gifts when they showed up. So you have that situation. In any case, the success of the Plymouth colony and the survival of the Plymouth colony meant that over the next couple of years, more Englishmen would start to show up. In 1621, a ship called the Fortune arrives with 35 passengers. 2 years later, 2 ships, the Anne and the Little James, arrive with about another 90 passengers. And what we begin to see is the growth of the Plymouth colony, the expansion of the English presence here in New England. A decade after Plymouth, more English Puritans show up in Boston. They establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And in the 1630s, the 1640s, the 1650s, the English presence in New England grows dramatically, putting tremendous pressure on the native peoples and leading to further complications, but that's the subject for another talk. In any case, in the build-up to 1620, both the native peoples and the English separatists who become the pilgrims went through traumatic changes, political shifts, demographic shifts. All of that eventually led to the collision of these 2 worlds with the arrival of the Mayflower in 1620. And that is the story I have to tell. Does anybody have any questions? Yes, sir.
why is Plymouth and the Puritans, why is that more famous than Jamestown as the initiating event? And secondly, the early image you showed of the Native Americans fishing, the boat in front had a fire going in the middle. What's going on with that?
It was I don't know specifically in that image. I don't know specifically in the image why there was smoke coming out of it, but the technique that the native peoples used to make those canoes was by burning out the hollow center of a log. So I don't know if John White was combining those two things into one image. Now, why does Plymouth get all the glory of being the founding moment? Because Jamestown was a commercial enterprise. Jamestown was set up to make money. It was bankrolled by investors in England. And the early settlers at Jamestown were all men. In fact, the first couple of generations of settlers at Jamestown were all men. Plymouth was different because it was families coming over, not for profit, but to establish villages where they could practice their religion freely. So there were different ideas behind the foundations of both of them. The only thing that really saves Jamestown was the discovery of tobacco and the hybridizing of tobacco to make it palatable to European mouths, and that drove the growth of Jamestown.
I understand. I can't be specific here, but
That's actually a common thread that you see in a lot of the early European impressions of the native peoples. Even Christopher Columbus in 1492, when he first ran into the native populations in the islands of the Caribbean, noted that they were well-formed, that they were very strong and muscular, they were a good-looking people, that they were very intelligent, but they didn't have Jesus, so they were savages. That's Columbus's words, right? And that they could be taught to be useful citizens of the king, useful subjects of the king and queen of Spain. So that's an impression that many of the early Europeans had when they first encountered the native peoples, that they were great people, but lacked civilization, lacked Christianity, and therefore were lacking in general. So that's not a unique impression that you see.
Any idea why the Wampanoags welcomed them? Because initially, the first settlement wound up killing them all off because of disease. Why would they want more of it?
But they didn't know that's where the diseases were coming from. Remember, this is before the understanding of germ theory and how diseases pass from person to person. So the Wampanoags saw huge numbers dying, and they needed an ally to defend their political standing in the relationship among the other peoples. So there's a lot of that kind of arithmetic that played into it.
You mentioned that the Native Americans would learn English and Spanish.
Mm-hmm.
Was there a common language among most of the people of this area beyond the villages?
There were linguistic groups. So the three major linguistic groups kind of in New England. You had the Algonquin language, which was kind of, if we were to kind of make a modern comparison, like European, like French, Spanish, and Italian are all very closely related. That would be kind of what the Algonquin was. There was an Iroquoian group, mainly among the regions of the Great Lakes, and there was a Siouan group, so coming out of the Great Plains and sweeping into the eastern woodlands. So there were broad linguistic groups that were related to one another. Now, obviously, if we were a native person, and this group over here spoke Algonquin, and that group over there spoke Abenaki, they would learn to communicate with one another. So much like in Europe today, many of the inhabitants were multilingual. They knew lots of different languages because it was necessary to communicate, to trade, for diplomacy, and all that sort of stuff. Yes?
Are there any clear lines of successor religions that the Pilgrims and the Puritans do today?
The Puritans are actually the Congregationalists of today. Here in New England, the Puritans are still around. They changed names, obviously. But, pretty much every old New England town has the first Congregational church and the second Congregational church. Those Congregationalists are the descendants of the English Puritans. The Separatists, I guess they kind of get rolled into the Congregationalism, New England Puritanism later on, but they are kind of doing their own thing. Now, we have to remember that religion at that time was very much more central to many people's lives than it is today. And what we see today in terms of religion in the United States is the product of several religious awakenings: the Great Awakening in the 18th century, the Second Great Awakening in the 19th century, which gave birth to all sorts of new different religious denominations, the Methodists and the Unitarians and the Universalists and all that sort of stuff. Those come gradually as a result of the Reformation and as a result of really the fertility, if you will, of the religious freedom that's established here in North America. All right, thank you. Happy Thanksgiving.